So I wanted to welcome everyone, and I wanted to let you guys know this is the 6th time I've been doing one of these conversations. We've done them on everything from empathy, organ donation, resilience, mindfulness, grief writing, and now brain research. And we have a very large group today, larger than I had expected. We have almost 80 people that signed up, which is really wonderful. And it really is a testament to how grief, I think, is becoming more talked about, and we're trying to normalize it. And I think because of COVID and because of everything we're going through in the world today with collective grief, it's become a more important topic, not only personally, but for just the world in general. So if people would want to have their cameras on, that would be lovely. It's always more fun to see people than to talk into a void. And we have people today here from university centers, from grief and hospice organizations. We have people from organ donation organizations, OPOs. We also have friends and family of mine that have either suffered loss or want to help other people, help support the people they care about who are going through tragedies and adversity. So many people are here for many different reasons, but at the base of it, we're all here because we're human and we're all going to have to deal and have already dealt with death in our lives. And really, this is the conversation that we want to be having. And I'm so happy that Mary Frances agreed to be here today. So as we're waiting, if anyone would like to just put in the chat room why they decided to come today, maybe what organization they're with, or where they're located in the US, or if they're in a different country, that would be great to put in the chat, whatever you would like and whatever you'd like to share. It's always so interesting to know where people are coming from. So Seattle, great. And Versity in Milwaukee, which is, it used to be called the Wisconsin Donor Network, which manages organ donation related activities. Phoenix, Life Bank, another organ procurement organization. Wonderful. Minnesota, Maryland. This is great. So I'll just start in a few more minutes. I want to respect everyone's time, and we're recording this episode today because many people, even if they did register, want to share it with other people or want to see it at the end again, or if they weren't able to come, they can enjoy it. So I am going to start off right now. Welcome. I'm Susan Angel Miller, and I am an author of a book, Permission to Thrive, My Journey from Grief to Growth. And I'm also a donor mom. And I am also passionate about normalizing grief and having conversations on topics surrounding it based on our personal story. So the next hour and 15 minutes will look something like this. I'm going to introduce myself and share a brief story of our personal journey over the last 13 years and explain why I do what I'm doing, why I'm so passionate about this. Then I'll introduce Mary Frances O'Connor and she can talk about her research and her takeaways for the audience and what she'd like to research in the future, what's on her plate. And if you can save your questions toward the end, we will definitely be having time to answer your questions. And that will be around maybe 1:45 where we'll start doing that. And again, because it's such a large audience today, I'd love for people to keep themselves mute if at all possible, and to turn your cameras on if you'd like, because it's so much more fun talking to faces instead of the blank computer screen. So let's see. I will begin. So in the 3 years since my book was published, I've understood how badly we've needed to have these conversations about grief to normalize it and to take away the awkwardness that we all feel around it. And especially now with COVID, having 1 million people or more having died and 9 or 10 people associated with each of those deaths. There are a lot of people, a lot of extra people that are affected by grief. And I wish that when grief hit our family, I wish that I had had a roadmap to follow that is similar to what Mary Francis's book has written about. So my story really begins about 13 years ago. My husband and I were living in Bayside, Wisconsin, a suburb north of Milwaukee. And we were pretty much living a pretty normal life. We had 3 daughters, Rachel, who was 9, Sarah, who was 12, and Laura, who was 14 and a half, all healthy and happy. And we were running, crazy like most families, but everything was going well. And then Laura started having headaches. She was a freshman in high school and worried about exams and her history and science fair, but she started complaining about headaches. But of course, teenagers have headaches, so we didn't worry too much about it. But they continued, and about 3 weeks into those headaches, they started becoming more worrisome. And one evening she slept next to me, and in the morning she threw up many times. She looked at me and asked me why I had 4 eyes, and she had a seizure all within about 45 minutes. And we called 911. She woke up, she was rushed to the hospital, where that morning the doctor told us that she had a mass at the back of her head. And I remember thinking, okay, she has a tumor, it's going to be removed and everything's going to go back to normal, because that's how things happen in our family. Later that afternoon, the surgeon told us that based on the MRI, the tumor could be removed, and it would be removed in 2 days when the hospital operating room was available. Well, the headaches continued to go from bad to worse, and Laura continued to complain. And Ron and I were in the hospital room when Laura stopped breathing. They rushed to give her some pain medication, and they rushed her down to the operating room to put a shunt in to relieve the brain pressure. And when the surgeon walked out, he told us that the procedure went okay, but she wasn't responding the way they'd like. And the next thing we remember is we were up in the ICU room, where she was connected to every wire and screen and machine possible. And at that point, we were told that she really wasn't responding to pain. And I didn't even need to be told that, because as a mom, I could just tell that she was not there. But of course, this was still on the same day that we had rushed her to the hospital, and she had been at school the day before on a Tuesday afternoon complaining about headaches and worried about her Spanish homework. And here, less than 24 hours later, she was on breathing machines and not responsive. So it's almost too much to kind of have your head wrap around. And it took about 3 more days of being in the hospital, of the doctors really not telling us much, until the final MRI on a Saturday morning, where the surgeon had to tell us what we were afraid to admit to ourselves, that she had had a massive brain bleed, that the tumor had become too much for her body, and it wasn't survivable. So at that point, we're in, shock, but kind of on autopilot. And we went up to the family waiting room, where our family was waiting with us. And a few hours later, or actually not even that long, a woman in a white coat came in and gave us the first condolences that we would hear. And then she told us she was from the Wisconsin Donor Network, and asked us if we would consider donating Laura's organs. And again, kind of an incomprehensible question to be asked. when your daughter had been alive 3 days earlier. But we thought about it. Our rabbi was actually in the room with us. We asked him what he thought. He told us it was one of the highest mitzvahs to help save someone's life. And then our 12-year-old daughter, Sarah, at the time was in part of the conversation. And I remember her passion when she said to us, Mom and Dad, if Laura's organs could save the life of someone, why we should do it. And here we have our 12-year-old healthy daughter in front of us. And so that's what we decided to do, not realizing how important this little light in our story would become over the years, and how it would really create some meaning in something that otherwise was very meaningless. So it's hard in this short of period of time to explain the emotions that we went through while grieving Laura, how we went from a private family in Milwaukee to a more public facing family where we still had to raise our 2 other daughters, and we kind of, my husband and I made a pact, kind of a silent pact between us, that we weren't going to sacrifice the lives of our 2 other children, who were 9 and 12 at the time, to something that we couldn't undo. We couldn't foresee living the next 4 or 5 decades without Laura, but we also couldn't see sacrificing our family's life and what we loved before this had all happened. It would have been a domino effect where things would have just gotten worse even from there. So it's hard to put these challenges into words, the grieving, the changing of our identities, to understand that we no longer had 2 living children, that we no longer had 3 living children, but we now had 2 living children, and all the things that you hear about in the aftermath of a horrific loss. I mean, we had survived what everyone considers their worst nightmare, the losing of a child, but we had to learn how to live in that reality. And we really didn't have a roadmap to follow, and we didn't know, should we wear black for the rest of our lives, and what would our life look like? And so in the last decade, I've also had other health issues and kind of crazy things that have happened that you can read about more in my book. I don't want to take too much time in telling the details of my story, because I want to focus on what Mary Frances has done with her brain research. But I guess the short of it is that since I wrote my book, which was very important to me to kind of record what had happened and to kind of process all that had happened, I've understood how badly we need more conversations about grief, how we need to normalize it, not make it as awkward, and really take it out of the shadows. It still seems like it's kind of the third rail of conversation. We now talk about politics, religion, sex, money, but death is still the one topic that's very challenging to discuss. And everyone seems to be very worried about saying the wrong thing, so then they don't say anything at all, which in my opinion, and if you take one thing away from today, it's that say something, do something. We had lost Laura. We didn't want to lose the rest of our friends and family as well. So the segue now is that I connected. The best part about publishing the book is connecting with people who have lost children, who have lost loved ones, and also with people who specialize in this field of grief. And I connected with Mary Frances after reading an article about her new book release, which was just a couple months ago. I ordered it on Kindle, immediately knew she was someone I wanted to talk with, because her recently published book, The Grieving Brain, resonated with me on so many levels. If you could see what I have in front of me, I have about 10 pages of highlighted passages that I printed out from her book, because so much of what she said resonated with me. And what she's done is it's been based on the research that she's done. So that was especially exciting to me. So I'm very thankful for Mary Frances's generosity in talking with us today. Mary Frances, you're on? Maybe give a hi to everyone.
Hello, everyone. Susan, it's so lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. And so I I wanted to read a little bit of a brief bio about Mary Frances, and then we can get started. So Mary Frances is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, where she directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab, which investigates the effects of grief on the brain and the body. She earned a doctorate from the University of Arizona in 2004 and completed a fellowship at UCLA. Following a faculty appointment at UCLA Cousins Center for Psychoneuroimmunology, she returned to the University of Arizona in 2012. Her work has been published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, Biological Psychiatry, and Psychological Science, and featured in Newsweek, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Having grown up in Montana, she now lives in Tucson. I was just talking to her before, and she goes from the extreme cold in Montana to the extreme heat in Tucson. I would love it. Mary Frances, if you would kind of talk to us about your research and where you think, why you decided to do this type of work, and where you think this research is going, and maybe some takeaways that we all can learn from it.
The work that I've been doing for now the past over 20 years really has at its heart the questions of why and how grief works, because understanding the why, I think, can be very comforting. Why does it hurt so much to lose someone who we're just beloved, you know? And how does the brain come to understand after, thousands of days waking up with someone in your house or in your bed? How does the brain come to understand and be able to predict their absence more likely than their presence? So those why questions have always been the science-y part of what I've wondered and spent time doing research on. And some of that also, I think, is people ask me, if there was a personal reason as well that I got interested in this work. And my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer when I was 13. And she actually lived for another 13 years, even though we were told she wouldn't survive the year. And so growing up with sort of death always being kind of in the background, and then occasionally in the foreground, when she died when I was 26, it just made me more comfortable with people who were grieving. And, if I'm interviewing people in my research studies and they cry uncontrollably, that just doesn't bother me, And so that feeling of sort of being able to really delve in and understand their experience and then map that onto what I was seeing in neuroimaging studies, right? In activation in the brain and responses in the body. For me, that was magic, such a privilege to get a chance to put these things together. I should say, I guess, also that in terms of writing the book, though, because, not most academics don't write for the general public, it really dawned on me at some point that even though a lot of research is being done on grief and bereavement, not a lot of it is getting into the hands of the people who could actually apply it to their own lives, could actually use that comforting knowledge of, oh, yes, this is totally normal, or, oh, that's why I'm doing or thinking or feeling this crazy thing that doesn't make any sense even to me.
So it's a great intro to why this is such meaningful work to you. And I remember one of the passages in your book that talks about why grief is so disorienting really stuck with me. And I'll read one of the passages if I could. A key problem in grief is that there's a mismatch between the virtual map we always use to find our loved ones and the reality after they die, that they can no longer be found in the dimensions of space and time. The unlikely situation that they are not on the map at all. The alarm and confusion that this causes is one reason grief overwhelms us. Maybe you can go into that a little bit more and how you actually can see this in the brain, and really delve a little bit more into what is that research kind of like, putting people in MRIs, and how are you finding what lights up and what doesn't?
Right. Uh, so the remarkable thing is that the brain really first encodes love, right? That it really does encode in the neurons, in that little gray set of cells. It encodes this bond we have with that one special, our one and only, whether that happens during falling in love with a partner, falling in love with your child, that actually physically changes the brain. And so then there's a belief that comes along with that bonding, and the belief is I'll always be there for you and you'll always be there for me. And that's the only reason that we're able to, kiss our husband or wife goodbye in the morning and we all go off our separate ways, or send our children off to school. If we didn't have that deep belief that we would all be back together again, and that, I could ask you right now, where is Ron? And you would know how to get to him, right? We spend a lot of time, and our brain spends a lot of real estate tracking where our loved ones are. And so they don't have to be in our physical presence in order for us to know that they're out there, right? That is that's the way it works. And so then you have this very unusual, thank God, very unusual situation where someone that you have this bond with dies. And the brain has a solution for them not being in your presence. Go get them, right? It's a simple solution. And your brain is motivating you in every chemical way it possibly can to do that. And the problem, of course, is they don't exist. It's not that they're lost, it's that the map doesn't work anymore. And that is incredibly disorienting and also anxiety provoking and just overwhelming and sadness inducing and guilt inducing and, all of those emotions. But it really does start with the bond. And so neuroimaging studies, which is done just in a regular scanner, like you might have a scan done on your knee, except these are scans done on the brain. And they're a special kind of scan that allows us to see where the blood is flowing in the brain. And because of that, we know where neurons are firing in the brain. And so we ask people, for example, in many of the studies that I have done, to bring us photographs of the person who's died. So to bring photos of Laura, for example, Susan. And then we scan those and we show them on goggles, like a little video screen, while they're laying in the neuroimaging scanner. And we see what parts of the brain are active, are firing when looking at that photo, as compared to looking at a photo of a stranger, say, for example, or even just someone you know. But the difference between what happens when the brain is firing with this person who you're grieving for and what happens when the brain is just perceiving a person, the difference then is what's underlying or what's enabling that grief experience. And so we have these studies also with living loved ones. This is how we know that the bond is created first. There's this wonderful study of men looking at their kindergartners compared to other children in the kindergartner's class. And we see over and over again that there are particular brain areas that are important for enabling us to sort of be able to say, oh yes, that one, that's my one and only. And it's a very rewarding experience, when you see your own child or your own spouse differently from just seeing a person. And so what's fascinating then is to try and understand what happens over time as the brain comes to learn to be able to change its predictions about the world. Just as you were saying, Susan, how do I even live in the world now? What does it mean to be a parent if this child is gone? Or what does it mean to be a daughter if my mother isn't in the world? And so those are the kinds of studies that we've been doing.
It's so interesting because when you talk about how hard it is for the brain to process what has happened, the trauma, the suddenness, I remember what I used was talking to friends and family and talking kind of ad nauseum to them about the events leading up to the, her headaches, rushing her to the hospital, the MRI result, the grief, talking about it was like I almost could tell at that moment, those moments, that my brain needed to hear myself tell it over and over for it to understand this complete earthquake that had happened in our life. The fact
Yeah.
that all of our assumptions about the way that life is supposed to work were all of a sudden just cratered. I mean,
Yeah.
you're supposed to be able to believe that your healthy 14-year-old is going to finish out her high school freshman year, and that if she does have cancer, that cancer is not going to take her before you even have an oncologist that you have a relationship with. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a cancer diagnosis, but it was more like a car crash. And
Yeah,
how do you,
absolutely.
so I'm kind of learning that grief is this combination, it's an onion. I often compare it to an onion, that part of the grief is about being so sad that Laura didn't get to live the magnificent life that she was destined to live, and that she didn't get to do all the things that we've all been able to do. But the other large piece of it that we often don't admit is how sad it was for Ron and me as parents. I mean, we were robbed of a third of our life going
Yeah.
forward with her not being there. And so it's this it's this combination of being sad for the person who died, but also having this hole in your life that you all of a sudden
Yeah.
have to figure out, how do you fill it, and how do you go back to
Yeah.
living a life that you can then have faith in again.
That's right. And I think, even in the brain imaging studies, that description that people give, which sounds so poetic, of sort of, I feel like there's a hole in me, or I feel like part of myself is missing. I think that is actually partly how the brain is processing things in the following way. So it isn't just that there's you and me, right? It isn't just there's me and then there's Laura, but there's a big part of the brain that encodes we, right? And we is a part of me and also a part of you. But when that person is gone, the brain has to understand, how do I even operate in the world without the we, with the we being all confusing, and that feeling of missing a piece of yourself, and that sadness for yourself, I think is partly because of how we encode our relationships. There's this overlap in our understanding, and even in very simple things like picking up the phone to call someone, right, and then realizing, oh, I can't do that, or making dinner and thinking, oh, I guess it doesn't matter if I put olives in because she's not eating it. And, so it doesn't matter that she didn't like olives. There's in every single little interaction and moment, there's trying to learn, what does this look like now? I think that's part of why grieving takes so long. There's just so much processing and relearning and updating to do. And then to figure out how to build a meaningful life and restore a life kind of around that we whole, is a very long process.
Right. And I think something else that you wrote about in the book was very, very intriguing to me, that, change can happen and trauma can occur, and someone can this big transition can happen in your life, and time in itself isn't what necessarily heals, but it's
Yeah.
that working through of the emotions that helps that process go forward. That it's almost like you need this transformative work, like you have to just dive into the painful emotions, and then over time there's the healing or the moving forward. But I think sometimes people think just the passage of time in itself
Yeah.
will heal the gap. And I don't know if
Yeah.
you talked to people about that, or did other research on that.
I like, after this much time, I've come to think of grieving as a form of learning. right? And I think grieving as a form of learning is a little bit helpful in part because then it feels a little more familiar. We've all been learning from the moment we got to this planet, right? And so we know learning is frustrating. We know learning is hard. We know that when we're learning something, we often want to give up, right? And so maybe that makes grieving feel a little more familiar. But I think it also really speaks to your brain needs new experiences in order to understand, oh, when I do the laundry, I don't open her drawer to put socks in it. You know, if you're doing things in the world, your brain is going to learn what it's like now. If you completely withdraw from the world, time can pass, but it doesn't mean that your brain is having any new experiences, right? And so it's not able to update, oh, this is what it means to be widowed. This is what it means to retire without the person that I've been planning to do this with for my, the last 20 years. But if you go out and do things, even while they are painful, you do have a learning. You do come to understand. And especially if, as you said, you also get an opportunity to express to people, oh, this is what I'm learning, or this is how it is now, or this is how it's changed. That gives our brain a chance to sort of go over it again, just as you were saying, and kind of learn again.
It makes so much sense because we had to continue parenting our 9 and
Yeah.
12-year-old, and we had to go out and we had to drive down Lake Drive, which
Yes.
I still remember driving my 9-year-old to third grade. And we live in a fairly small town where people know each other. And I remember in the moments between my minivan passing the minivan coming toward us, I could see the woman in the driver's seat giving me that look of pity. And
Yep.
I sensed it even in those few seconds. And that
Yeah.
was the look that we got all over town. And I remember
Yeah.
going into like a Starbucks and standing in line, and I saw people I knew, and I saw parents of children that had been in Laura's grade. And I remember understanding the awkwardness of the situation. And I
Yeah.
remember actually going up to one of these moms and saying, "Oh, how's uh, you know, Emily doing?" Or how's Emily doing? And the mom would say, "Oh, she's great. She works at, this clothing store down the road." And I'd say, "Oh, Laura loved those jeans." And oh my gosh, I had brought up Laura's name. I had
Yeah.
I had brought up the unthinkable, and therefore the woman, I could see she was red in the face, she had tears in her eyes, but you could also sense this relief that I had
Yeah.
talked about Laura. And
Yeah.
so it was like we had to just keep forging ahead. And it took a lot of
Yes.
courage to go out to the grocery
Yes.
store every day, to
Yes.
be able to, you not know who was I going to run into, what were they going to ask. And
Yeah.
it was that struggling to just keep one foot in front of the other and have those bad experiences with people and also have the good experiences with people so that we could
Yeah.
move forward.
Yeah. So much of our relationships with people is in our mind as well. And so that relationship that you have with your loved one, the part that lives on in your mind, it doesn't go away just because physically they're not present. And so it means that for you, they're still very much alive in one sense, not that you don't know the reality, but that you also still have this bond. And so trying to explain that or live in a world where you're having this continuing bond and the rest of the world isn't sure how to manage that, that's incredibly difficult between people. And what you've been able to do, I think, is to give people permission, give them permission to get it wrong sometimes, give them permission to think and talk about Laura. And that's a tremendous gift. Many of us, in the midst of especially early grief, we don't even have that sort of ability. And you and your husband clearly really took it on as we're going to be out in the world and we're going to do this. And I think that's remarkable.
Also, tell me, Mary Frances, there's a whole community out there researching grief and trauma and the recovery from it. What else can you tell us about how that field is evolving, and how, when you, and maybe a little bit more about how you conduct your research
Mhm.
studies. And is it more from the MRI that you're learning the information, or are you learning it from the conversations that you're having with the patients? And the, the other aspect is, one of the things you mentioned in your book is that um, therapists often are only talking to the people who are grieving in a very challenging way, and so they're
Mhm.
not seeing all the people that are grieving and are recovering and do not have intense depression. So I'm
Yeah,
I'm mixing up several questions in there,
it's
but
okay.
take it where you
Yeah.
want.
There is an ever growing group of scientists, researchers, clinicians who study grief and grieving. And, when I started this work, I was really told, well, you can't just study grief. That's not a topic for study. And I kind of persisted. And I think we're actually reaching sort of a critical mass now where there are enough colleagues that I can get together with and we can hash out ideas and how would we test that? And if we disagree about something, why might that be? And how would we figure it out, right? In a very scientific way. For me, the inclusion of the brain images is largely because the way our brain is set up, the way it functions, can constrain our psychological experience. And so you can I think of it this way sometimes. The conversations that I have with people and understanding their psychology, their experience, their feelings, their thoughts, that's the most important thing. That's where the heart of psychology lies. But you can almost think about, I like to make the analogy to water. Water is both uh, a solid or a vapor or a liquid. And it's also hydrogen and oxygen, right? So it's not that it's one or the other. And so I think of brain imaging in the same way. What's important is that there are these thoughts and feelings and behaviors, and also that there is brain machinery that is enabling that to happen. And if there are things about the brain machinery that constrain our experience, or ways that we can understand how learning works in the brain and then be able to help people who are going through this process, then that feels like a useful connection between them to me. I think that because people are not aware of how much research is being done right now and some of the outcomes that we're discovering about how grief works and kind of what's normal and what's working for people, and that's done from a lot of different lenses. It's not just psychologists, it's epidemiologists and it's sociologists and you know cardiologists and so forth. By having all these different lenses, I think we get further in what we understand. Um,
So,
so
and I know that there are lots of effects that grief have on the body
yeah,
itself. It's not just thoughts. I remember
yeah,
the week after Laura died, and some cousins from California came to visit us, and they were both doctors.
yeah,
And I remember laying on the couch and basically telling this one cousin that I thought I was having a heart attack, and
yeah,
that she had to take my pulse. And I mean, I felt such a heaviness on my chest, and
yeah,
almost trouble breathing, and a heart racing. And it's like, I think it's called like a syndrome, like a heart, your heart is broken. And I remember sighing a lot. And
yeah,
since that time, I mean, I've understood how stressful grief can
yeah,
be on a body. And
yes,
over the number of years that it's taken me to kind of work through it, and I believe it actually caused additional health issues for myself
yeah,
because of the stress that I had been under.
yeah,
So there's research going on there as well with the
yes.
body.
Yes, absolutely. So, in the psychoneuroimmunology that you described, it was partly because I wanted to find out the impact also on the body, on the brain, the neuro part, and also on the body. And just as you say, it is incredibly stressful. So, for the vast majority of people, cortisol, the stress hormone, goes up. Blood pressure goes up a little bit, heart rate goes up a little bit. And for the vast majority of us, it then levels out again, right? It normalizes over time as your brain comes to understand okay, this terrible thing has happened. I am still in a situation where I'm pretty safe, right? In my current situation. And I've come to sort of I'm better able to expect what's going to happen day to day. And that helps your body to calm down a little bit. But I think, one of the recent studies we finished was actually looking at what we call prolonged muscle relaxation, a form of relaxation training for people who are bereaved. And it's incredibly useful to give your body a break, right? To have some sort of skill you can pull out at any time to figure out how to change your breathing, how to change your muscle tension so that you can give your body a break in this really stressful experience. It turns out it helps your body, and it also turns out that it helps your mind too. So that's a very useful it's sort of that by knowing the science, we also then are able to find ways in of sort of how to help.
Are there any myths and conceptions that you've been able to kind of dispel that you want to share with us today? Just to kind
Sure.
of help ground us in what's real and what's not.
I think one of the most helpful things is the difference between grief and grieving. So, grief is that feeling that overwhelms you, the wave, that pang of grief. And grieving is the way that grief changes over time without ever going away, right? So, let's say the first 100 times you have that wave of grief, you may think, I'm not even going to get through this moment. This is completely unbearable. And the 101st time, it's still grief. It still feels awful. It may also feel a little bit familiar, right? And you may know, okay, I am going to get through this moment. I may even have a few ideas of how to find some comfort in this moment. But what that means is that it can be 6 months, 6 years, 6 decades later. And when you become aware of this loss that you still have, you're going to feel grief, right? In that moment, my sister is engaged, for example, and I know on her wedding day, we're going to have strong feelings of grief about my mom not being there, right? That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with our grieving, right? It doesn't mean that we haven't been adapting, that we haven't been restoring a meaningful life for ourselves, that we don't have big, enjoyable lives that are around the fact that we're also people who have grief that overwhelms us. Do you see what I mean? Sort of this difference, I think, is helpful in making people realize I didn't do anything wrong just because I feel grief today.
Right. And it doesn't mean that you can't feel happy and sad at the same moment.
Exactly.
That
That's
is
right.
the way human emotions go. And I think at least I used to think that the emotions were more like two pebbles in two different hands, or
Yeah.
a pebble in each hand. And the reality
Yeah.
is it's not the
It's all
case.
mixed together.
All
Yeah.
mixed together. And I also like reminding people that when we talk about grief, it's not just about grief of a person who's been lost. A lot of times grief can be about an event that happened in your life
Yep.
that you're regretting, or a change of
Yeah.
career that you didn't want, or you're
Yeah.
moving or losing friendships.
Yeah.
It
That's
can
right.
be really any kind of loss. So
Yeah.
grief and loss can sometimes be like one and the other. And I love how
Yeah.
you use the word love as well.
Yeah.
Because one of
Yeah.
my favorite quotes is, that grief is love with no place to go.
Yeah. Exactly. Because that bond is still there. It's not like the bond goes away. The bond is literally physically in your brain. It's not going anywhere. And so that can be true. And when you become aware of it and that person isn't there, you're going to feel grief. And you're also going to have this full life around that. I think it's partly helpful because grieving is then this process over time with experience. And for most of us, we now know, the 5 stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote about. They're true about grief, right? In the moment of grief, we feel angry, we feel depressed, we feel some acceptance, but they're not a linear set of stages. It's not about grieving, right? So it's not like you do all of anger and then that's done, and now you're doing all of depression, and eventually you'll get to all of acceptance. It doesn't really work that way. Grieving over time means that usually, for most of us, those waves of grief become less intense and less frequent, thankfully, but they don't go away. And so I think one of the things that we're really actively studying, and a lot of people don't know we've actually been studying this for 20 years, is there is this small group of people, maybe 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 bereaved people. And for them, you can see it if you think about time and sort of the intensity of these waves of grief. In most of us, of course, it starts very high, and then over time, less intense, less frequent. You can see this change over time, we think of as grieving. But there's this small group of people who it just doesn't change. The frequency and the intensity doesn't change. And so as clinicians and researchers, we've come together and we call that prolonged grief disorder, and it has really specific criteria. And the reason is, if we're talking about the same thing, then we're able to find interventions that really work. And we have really good psychotherapy now for people who have this persistent, high, intense, and frequent grief. And so what's important about that from my perspective is knowing that can be very comforting for people who are experiencing it, because they realize, oh, I'm not having the experience everyone else is having, and there's some hope for me. So we do treatment with people who've had prolonged grief for 10 years, and they still end up doing better after the therapy. It's not that we're trying to take their grief away. That's not going to happen. We just said, it could be 60 years later and you're still going to have grief. What we're hoping to do is get them onto that trajectory, onto that healing, grieving trajectory. And so it's not going to go away, but it's not going to be like it was 6 months ago, a year ago, 10 years ago for them.
So you brought up a really interesting point of kind of contention in the grief space, which is hard to believe that I'm even aware of this little controversy, that there's been this new diagnosis of prolonged grief. And some people are pushing back on that, saying that that the DSM manual, I'm not even sure what it, you understand that better than I do, but that they've labeled prolonged grief as over a year if you're feeling a lot of these very serious emotional disturbances after a year. They're classifying it as a diagnosis of prolonged grief. And from my perspective, I remember walking with a friend and at 9 or 10 months of grieving for Laura, and saying to my friend, do you think people are going to think that I need to get over the grief at a year mark? I had this image that after a year, I wouldn't be able to grieve anymore, and that people would think, come on, Susan, get over it. It's been a year. And I don't know why that year is such a marker, but to think that, I would say that I was in that prolonged grief category, because I don't think I felt in any way normal for 3 to 5 years. I still obviously am in distress over not having Laura here, but it definitely took longer than a year. So can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the question isn't, did you feel normal after a year? It's, did you feel the way you did a month after Laura died? So the difference isn't, you're not going to be, no one is done grieving, right? Sometimes I ask people, when did you get over your wedding day? Right? That's not really a question that makes any sense. When did you get over your daughter dying? That's not a question that makes any sense, right? You are going to now be a person who gets overwhelmed with grief. That's just how it works. The difference is that at a year, if you look at that sort of data, right, where we're asking people what their experience is like day to day, and it actually takes a lot of training to be able to diagnose prolonged grief, right? You don't just sort of read a set of sentences and then say, oh, yes or no, right? There's a lot of training behind diagnosis. But in any case, the key is that at a year, we can start to see the divide between people where things are not changing, and we can actually predict they're not going to change in the future, and people who, they don't feel normal, but you can see there has been change. And about a year, you can start to see the difference between those groups of people. And that's why we think about a year. Before that, everyone looks a little all over the place, and you can't predict how people are going to turn out. At a year, we know this person isn't on a trajectory that we would hope for. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I hope the takeaway for the average person that is, sees the little headline in the New York Times, and where they talk about scientists have now declared that a year, putting a time frame on grief. I think a lot of people in the grief community have worked really hard to be able to say you grieve in however long it takes, in whatever
That's
way
right.
you need to do. And my concern is that that message, I think, still needs to get out there, that
Yeah.
we all do it so differently and we do it at different times, and we shouldn't
Yeah.
think that our husband is doing it the wrong way, that our children
That's
are
right.
doing it the wrong way.
That's right.
And
I
so
think,
that's important.
I mean, I do think that the science communication around it was quite poor, especially in that way, to be able to explain the difference between these groups of people and sort of the trajectory. But in addition, most of us are reacting to the fact that there's not a lot of good grief education, period. And so if you've been told the whole time you've been grieving that you should get over it, and now you hear this thing from doctors that says it's a year, it all sounds the same. It isn't the same, but I absolutely understand why it feels the same, right? The key for me also is that in psychology training, in graduate training, and in psychiatry training in medical school, we get zero training on grief. None. Absolutely none. The fact that we're able to identify now that there is this small proportion of people who have this seeming real disorder in the way they're reacting means they have to also learn, what does grief look like? What does it typically look like? What is that suffering? How does that express itself so differently across so many people? And the training, I think, actually will have a truly beneficial effect. We also know prolonged grief is not the same as depression. And that was through very careful research. Antidepressants, we know, they don't help yearning. Yearning is at the heart of prolonged grief. It's only because we had criteria where we could distinguish people with prolonged grief from people with depression that we could do a study and say, please stop prescribing antidepressants for people who have prolonged grief. If you have depression, which of course you can, then they can be helpful. You can have depression after the death of a loved one. You can also have both, just like you can have depression and anxiety. But it's by being able to do that fine-grained research that we can learn a little bit more. And some of the neuroscience studies showing there are differences even in the brain,
Well, I appreciate that. And I think having all this research will also get at why some people are resilient, why some people fall into a dark place, and why others
Yeah.
actually have emotional growth following a tragedy or a trauma, and you wouldn't expect it. And
Yeah.
in my book, one of the reasons I decided I was going to write my book for sure is learning about the topic of post-traumatic growth,
Yeah.
which it was a topic I had never heard about. I had heard about post-traumatic stress disorder, but just
Yeah.
those words together, post-traumatic growth, it was really revolutionary for me. And it made me feel less guilty that we were,
Yeah.
surviving, and maybe
Yeah.
beyond surviving, doing better than okay after
Yeah.
losing a child. And then, um, so I've learned a lot about post-traumatic growth, and you mentioned it in your book as well, of how you're trying to do research there as well, figuring
Yeah.
out how the brain learns, how the brain takes meaning and purpose and the
Yeah.
deeper friendships and integrates that into their loss. So I want to make sure that we give people time to put
Yes.
their questions in the chat room. I mean, I think personally would like to talk to you for like hours, because I feel like we could go into so many different aspects of grief, but I want to make sure that we have have chance for the audience to pose questions that they think that are on their mind, because we all deal with this in an awkward way, because not only do social workers and nurses and psychiatrists get so little grief education, but the average person
Mhm.
then doesn't get very much either.
Right. That's right. And questions and answers are almost always my favorite part because it's it's the part that you can actually know how to, by asking a question, it helps us to know what's on your mind and what things might we know that we could help offer as possible ways to apply it.
Right.
Yeah.
I know many of the people here are working with families who have lost
Yeah.
children or loved ones who then end up becoming who are organ donors. And I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of support that nurses and doctors and therapists give to families in the wake of tragedy.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, are there some takeaways that you learned from your research that can
Yeah.
inform them?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it is so interesting that it's I think studying people who are resilient and who have had post-traumatic growth like yourself, that finding meaning can be very important. And I feel that organ donation often wraps so clearly into understanding the ways that life goes on, that life is now, as well as carrying the absence with you. So I think it's a very natural way for these to fit together.
And I love how you mentioned, we had Susan Lubar on last year talking about mindfulness and
Mhm.
how, being in the present moment is so important in the grief process. And then I have several paragraphs that you mentioned in your book about the importance of being present in the moment.
Yeah.
I see a hand up. Rhonda, if you're able to type the question into the chat room, I think that would be the best.
Oh, okay.
Um,
But we have a question in the chat, it looks like.
oh, okay. So I really appreciated how you made cognitive neuroscience and functional neuroimaging understandable. Kudos. I was fascinated with the part about yearning, and very specific, and the nucleus accumbens, which are part of the brain reward system, the same area involved in drugs or abuse or other things people crave. Does this activation have relevance for treatment?
So this is a study that I did looking at people who have prolonged grief as compared to people who are adapting more resiliently, that she's referring to here. And remember, I talked about that bond, that change that happens in your brain when you fall in love with someone. That we think is partially happening in this nucleus accumbens. And what we discovered was that people who are yearning more after the death, they continue to have this activation in this reward part of the brain. And as I was saying, the brain has a solution to our loved one not being with us. It's go get them, right? And your brain is trying to motivate you by yearning to go and get them. And of course, that isn't working in a case where they can't be gotten. And so what we saw was more yearning also was going on with more activation in this area. It is true that this area is also activated when we crave other things, including drugs of abuse. But here's the distinction that I would make. Our loved ones are as important to our survival, our thriving, as food and water. Our loved ones matter as much as food and water. And so I think of that yearning as hunger or thirst. And I think we see even in other parts of the brain the way that yearning is encoded similarly to hunger and thirst. Now, drugs of abuse can sort of take over, right? When people take opioids, they often describe it as feeling incredibly safe and comforted and like falling in love, right? The key is that these relationships that we build, these are the natural ways that our brain gives us rewards, right? It rewards us for being with our loved ones. And so I don't so much think of yearning as craving like you would with drugs, I think of yearning as thirsting. We wouldn't say for someone who hasn't, for someone who is dehydrated, we wouldn't describe them as craving water or being addicted to water, right? Because that's what we need. We need our loved ones. And so seeing how that changes over time, I think will be an important next part of our research. We have a lot of studies of grief. We don't have a lot of studies of grieving where you look at the same person over several months or even a couple of years to see what changes in the brain. And we would particularly be interested in looking at the nucleus accumbens.
Thank you so much for that question and the answer. Let's see, using the metaphor, if yearning is like hunger and thirst, then it would not be pathological to experience it, but rather we work with them on how to stay connected to them in a meaningful way in their absence.
That's
And
right.
I have to say, I think that you also talked about that in your book, Mary Frances, when you talk about, how do we memorialize people? How do we honor them in their absence? And whether it's lighting a candle, on the day of, in the Jewish term, a yort site, which is every year we light a candle during the day that the loved one passed away. Whether it's gathering with friends on the day of the death or the day of the person's birthday. And I think what was so challenging in COVID was the lack of formal gatherings in person for Shivas, for funerals, for memorial services. And I think that's really challenging. I've often imagined what that would have been like if Laura had passed away during COVID, because
Yeah.
so much of our healing I can attribute to the social support that we got,
Yeah.
whether it was from the 1,000 people that came to the religious service, to the people who came to the cemetery, to the people who came to talk to us and to comfort us at the synagogue, and then all
Yeah.
the walks and talks and coffees and dinners and support that I got from friends and family. And that absence of that social support, what have you found out about
Mm.
that need for the social network?
Social support is one of the most predictive things of how people will do. And I think it really does get into this. It's not pathological to yearn for someone. It is that over time, we have to figure out how to transform our bonds with this person we continue to love who isn't in the physical world, right? So, whether that means, just as you say, memorializing them or living out their values or whatever way makes sense to you, but in addition, to also make loving connections with our living loved ones. I think someone's mic might be on, so if you are able to mute yourself, um, I think the key difference then is over time we still have to have living loved ones in our life, and so how to connect with them while bringing along the absence and this transformed relationship with the person who's not there. And so over time, that's a big goal. That's a lot to happen, but it happens for most of us.
I put myself on mute. There you go. So one of the last questions that we'll have today is a very practical one, and I think a very good one. It asks what are some suggestions of words we can use when having a conversation with someone who just lost a loved one? And maybe people can type in what they think are good things that they've learned when comforting someone, and then we can talk about it a little bit as well. And in terms of words, at least for me, I've learned one of the best things is to just be in the pain with the person. And if that just means sitting there holding the person's hand, that might be enough. In fact, that's acknowledging the person's pain without trying to take it away. I think a lot of times in our society, we try to say things that try to make it better. And then there's some things that are really not so good, where you would say, well, you still have two healthy daughters. Well, yeah, but I had Laura too, and
Yeah.
having two other healthy daughters doesn't ever replace the loss of Laura. And so there are many things that I think definitely are helpful. Mostly it's the listening, the showing up for the people, the being in the pain with the person, not trying to fix it, not using the words "at least." I
Yeah.
think if you can avoid the words, you know, and I learned this as well during the COVID period, when I would even say to my daughter who had to come home for college in her sophomore year, I would say, well, at least you weren't a freshman. Well, at least you didn't miss your high school graduation. And that just did not fly, because she was suffering her own loss and I was minimizing it.
Yeah. I
Um,
think there's a way in which, in that moment, they can't imagine feeling anything but the pain they're in right now. And we in the outside can maybe imagine a world where they won't feel as much pain, but that doesn't matter in the moment, right? And so I think being able to be there, even if what you say is, I don't really know what to say right now, but I want to hear what this experience is like, or just hang out with you, right? Just go for a drive, or just go sit by a lake or whatever. The being with them, and then knowing that you can imagine a future where they feel differently. I think being able to express to them, you're actually doing really well in an impossible situation. Even if your shoes don't match, you're actually doing pretty well in a really impossible situation. That sense of just being supported in however you're handling it is so helpful.
I had spoken with an author, Kelsey Crow, last
Mm,
year, and she talked about empathy.
yeah.
And one of the things that I loved, what she reminded me of, is do whatever you're good and want to do for that person. So if you like cooking food, bring over that dinner for the person. But if you don't like cooking, maybe take their kids to, a movie. Or if you like walking, go take a walk with the person, or, clean out their refrigerator. Whatever it is that you do best, that's what you should be doing, so that it aligns with, what you want. It's better to do something than nothing. And there was a comment in the chat about, Amy had said that she loves hearing about her brother who had passed away, and she loves hearing stories. And I have to say, that's another takeaway that I always like to leave people with, that, I loved when people sent me cards. Oftentimes they were Hallmark cards with a signature, and that's it. And although I did appreciate getting those cards, what I learned is, what really gave me a gift was when they would write a couple of sentences or a paragraph about my relationship with Laura, about their relationship with Laura, a story about Laura that I might not have heard about, because it was learning stories about her that learning memories that I wasn't going to be able to make memories of her in the future. So it was a true gift. And I think mentioning the person's name, I've yet to hear anyone who is sad, who gets sadder when the person's name is mentioned. And I
Yeah.
think we all worry that by mentioning Laura's name, I'll cry. And
Yeah.
the reality is I might cry, but maybe I needed to have that cry.
Yeah.
And it's been a real gift to be able to keep talking about her, because I still am her mom. And that's where that
Yeah.
brain, even 13 years later,
Yeah.
that bond is
Never
still
gonna
there.
change.
And
Yeah.
so there is no closure. And I think that is one of the myths out there, that
Yeah.
there is going to be some endpoint where we all of a sudden forget and we're fine with it all. And that's just, I don't think that happens.
Yeah. I think it's also worth mentioning that repair is also always possible. So I have said things to grieving people and then thought, oh my God, why did I say that? Or I'll say something and they react with such anger. We sometimes forget that anger is really a part of grief. A student told me a story about her next door neighbor. The husband died, And at Christmas time, she and her boyfriend went over and said, "Hey, would you like us to put up lights on your house? Something that we know your husband always did." And she got really angry and was like, "No, I don't need someone helping me to do that," and sort of slammed the door. And then 2 days later came over and knocked and said, "I'm sorry, everything is just so raw. I would actually be really genuinely touched if you would help me do this." And so I think we forget that in the moment, people are angry and their volume, the emotion dial, volume dial is just way up. And so coming back and saying, "Hey, I think what I said didn't really fit the moment. And I just want to say, I wish it hadn't gone that way. And maybe you could tell me how things are now," I think is really important too.
Well, that's great. It's a good way to end our conversation with the practical, because we all deal with it every day. Um, we're getting close to the end of the time that we had said we were going to go till to 1:15, and I just want to thank Mary Frances. Thank you so much for being on with us and sharing your experiences and your research. And I have to say, I highly recommend The Grieving Brain. And I want to make sure that we in the chat, if you scroll up at the chat, I'll put this in a follow-up email to everyone as well. But you can, The Grieving Brain, and then my book Permission to Thrive, they're on Amazon or at private bookstores. And we both, I know, would love to have you communicate with us, contact us by email, social media, all that good stuff, because I think for both of us, it's really a passion project of trying to normalize grief in whatever way we can, and to take away the awkwardness, and just to make people a little bit more grief literate out there, because really grief is mental health as well. And we know we need to be more conscious of that. So I really appreciate everyone coming. And Mary, Mary Frances, do you have a few closing words that you'd like to impart?
I'm just so grateful. There are so many more of these conversations than I have ever known in the time I've been doing this work, and I'm really grateful for your courage bringing this to people and your perseverance of continuing to have these conversations, giving people permission.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone again, and I hope everyone has a great day, and that we keep in touch. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.